Hello over there again. Welcome back to this another video on the Spring Boot playlist. And I am actually glad that you're here again. We're going to have another session on this video. So in this particular video, we're going to look into how to implement the Spring Data JPA and how to use this powerful library provided by the Spring Boot in order to persist and perform all the CRUD operations on our entities in our database. So I hope you will find this content useful and it meets your needs. So without waste of time, let us have a recap of what we covered in the previous video so that you can be able to reconnect with this video. Please, if you have not watched the previous lessons from lesson 1 to 7, I would argue that you take a bit of time and watch them so that you can be able to reconnect to this one. So in the last video on lesson 7, we implemented the database layer, and we implemented how to tell Spring and how to connect the Spring Boot application to the database. And we did that by following these steps, by adding the required dependencies in our POM file, and also by specifying the properties, the database connection properties in our application.properties file, and then by running the application to demonstrate how it picks up that properties and connect to the database. So I'm going to go back to our code and then highlight these properties. These are the properties you need to specify in your application in order to be able to connect your Spring Boot application to your database. All right. So in this particular lesson, we are now going to be able to demonstrate how we can be able to create the data module and how we can be able to persist that data module in our database. In other words, we are going to create the entities and then be able to persist these entities in our database. And the tool we are going to use here is the Spring JPA, and we are going to explain briefly what Spring JPA means, and then we are going to implement it in the code. So this is the layer we are going to implement. You can see according to the basic framework architecture diagram, we have already implemented the controller where we only created one endpoint, and we have implemented this database connection where we added the properties required by our application to connect to the database. And now we are going to implement this particular layer called the persistence layer, where we define our persistence logic. We define the logic for persisting our entity in our database. And then in the next video, we are going to implement this another layer called the service layer, where we define our business logic. All right. So what we are going to do in this particular video is that we are going to create a symbol data class or a symbol data module, or we can call it entity. And then we are going to map this entity into the table using this Spring Data JPA. And then the entity we are going to create is the student entity, where we are going to create a simple student table which shall have the student ID and the student registration number, the surname of the student, the first name of the student, the last name of the student, the date of birth of the student, and also the course the student is taking. So this will be the field or the columns our table will be able to have. So, and then after creating this module or this entity class, then we are going to create a simple interface called the persistence interface, or in other words, I will call it the JPA persistence interface, that will now extend from the JPA repository. And this JPA repository is the repository which is provided by this JPA library, and it has the functions and methods which will allow us to observe and persist our entity in a database. so that we can be able to perform all the CRUD operations like creating an entity, updating an entity, adding an entity, or deleting an entity, and all sort of database operations. So we will be implementing this JPA repository, and on top of this repository we can also define our own methods in this interface if we want to define our own custom methods to manipulate our entities. And then after that we are also going to before we go there, let us explain a brief what JPA repository is and what is JPA in particular. So Spring Data JPA, Spring provides a powerful library for data manipulation and persisting the entities, so that you don't have to create all this code for database connection manually. And this library is what we are calling the Spring Data JPA. A JPA is Java Persistence API or library which enables you to persist your entities in your Spring Boot application. And this is the recommended specification by Spring Boot for managing your objects in your application. And then there are so many implementations of this particular, sorry about that. So there are so many implementations of this Spring JPA. So we have the Hibernate implementation, we have the Top Link implementation, and also the Open JPA implementation, and we have many other implementations of Spring Boot JPA. So for our case, we are going to use the Hibernate implementation of Spring Boot JPA, and this is the implementation of JPA that we are going to be using. So one advantage of using Spring Boot JPA is that it enables you to reduce the boilerplate code, the amount of code that you have to write in order to connect to the database and interact with your entities and tables in your database. So with this powerful library, it provides an abstraction so that you can be able to only reuse the methods that you want. Unless you want to add your own custom methods, then you can be able to add that, but most of the implementations of database connections has been provided through this powerful JPA library or the JPA API for database connection. So this is what we will be covering in this particular video, and then in the subsequent video we will now look and implement the next layer, which is the serves layer, where we start now defining our business logic for our application. So without a waste of time, let us go direct to our code and start implementing these modules, and then after that we create the corresponding JPA repository. So what I'm going to do, the way I'm going to do it, and the way I recommend that you also follow the same convention, is that in your application always separate your code by putting them in different sub packages or subfolders, so that it becomes very easy for you to manage your code and understand the code. So here in the previous lesson, I've created a package called controller for keeping all the controller classes, and you can see this is one of the controller class in this package. So because I'm going to implement a different layer, which is actually the persistence layer or the data layer, then I'm going to create a different package where I'm going to keep all my data classes or the entity classes. So I'm going to create another package and call it the entity package, and then in this package, this is where I will create and keep all my entity classes. So I'm going to right click and create another Java class called student class, and this student class, because I want it to become to be mapped by the JPA into a table, I have to add another annotation called @entity, and this annotation is what will tell Spring Boot that this class should be mapped as a table in the database. So in the database, Spring Boot will come and connect to this database and then create this class called student. But if you want to change the name of the table in our database, then you can specify it here with this annotation by providing the name for your application using the name attribute. So for example, you want your database, you want your table to be called the student table, the student table. And then when you run this application, then Spring Boot is going to use this specific name to name the table. If you don't provide this name, then Spring Boot will simply use the default class name as the table name. So I'm going to use the default class name, but in the subsequent lessons in the entities that we are going to create, we will be using specifying our own name, so that we are able to understand exactly what kind of table names we are creating. So we said that this entity is going to have these properties, and we are going to specify that this ID is going to be the primary key, and it is going to be auto-generated once we create a new student record, and then the registration number and the surname and the first name, last name, date of birth, and also the course the student is taking. So we are going to specify these properties here, and these properties will be mapped by the JPA as the table columns when we create this table. So we are going to add another annotation here called at ID, and this annotation is the JPA annotation, which tells Spring Boot that this particular column should be the primary key. It should be the ID which identifies the table, the unique record in this table. And then we are also going to specify that this ID should be automatically generated by our database engine. And here we are going to specify the strategy which will be used to generate this primary key value. So we are going to specify the strategy attribute, and this strategy attribute will then be used to generate this ID value. So we are going to say generation type. So we have many types of strategies for generating this. We can use auto, identity, or sequence. We will explain this later when we look at Spring Boot JPA in detail. So for now, I'm going to specify that auto, so that it means that this ID is going to be automatically generated by the MySQL engine when we create a new student record. And then what is the ID field? The type of the ID field is going to be of the type long, and then it is going to be an ID. All right. And then also I'm going to have the student registration number, which is of the type string. And then also I'm going to have the student surname, which is also of the type string. And then I'm also going to have the student first name. I'm going to add the student first name, which is also of the type string, and the same to the student last name, which is of the type also string. And then we are going to add the date of birth of that particular student, which is going to be of the type date, and then we are going to call it DOB, which is the date of birth. And then also we are going to specify the course the student is taking. For example, if we are taking medicine or information technology, and that is going to be of the type string, and we are going to call that field the string, the course I mean. And then these are the fields that the table will have. So when we run this application right now, then Spring Boot is going to look into our pom.xml file and find that we have this JPA library added, and we are also specifying that we need to connect to MySQL using MySQL connector. And then it comes to the application properties file, and see that we specified that we need to connect to this particular database. And then now it will go and see that there is this annotation called at entity, and Spring Boot now is going to use that JPA dependency to create this table with these columns, and this table is going to be created in this particular database. So this is how you create a simple entity in your database. If you like, also you can add another annotation called at column, where you specify the column name. So if you specify the column name here, then Spring Boot will create this column with the name you have specified here. If you don't add that, then Spring Boot will use the default property name which you have added here. So I'm not going to confuse you a lot with this a lot of annotations, but we will look into them in more detail when we look at the Spring Data JPA. Now here we have created a simple data class, and now in the next lesson I will want us now to now create the interface which will then extend from the JPA repository, and then it will be able to persist this entity that we have created here. So I don't want to put a lot of content in one video. I want to divide it so that you can be able to understand the concept very fast. So in the next video we will look at the next step 2 of creating the JPA interface, and that JPA interface must extend from the JPA repository, and we are going to tell this JPA repository which entity do we want to persist, and then we will provide this entity, and then we will be able to persist that particular entity. Otherwise, I hope you find this content really very useful, and if you like it, give it a thumbs up, and also consider subscribing and also sharing it with a friend who might benefit from the content. You can also join our team and be able to access more content on the same. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and see you in the next lesson, please.